One.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Glenn Howard. I'm the president of the Jamestown Foundation, and we're delighted that you're here to participate in this webinar that we're hosting today called The Future of Tibet. As many of you know, March 10th marks the 62nd anniversary of the 1959 Tibet uprising against the People's Republic of China. It was very much a dark period in Tibet's history that resulted in the crushing of the rebellion, which solidified China's control over Tibet and led to numerous and continuing ongoing human rights abuses in the decades that followed and continue to this day. Today, Beijing is instituting massive infrastructure projects to further tie the region to China while forcing Tibetans into repressive, militarized vocational training and labor transfers. The cultural influence of Tibetan Buddhism and the region's geostrategic location make Tibet an area of importance in world affairs, begging the question of what are U.S. policy options in the embattled roof of the world, and what will they be in the new Biden administration as it comes in? And to answer those questions today, we're delighted that we have speaking is Ngodup Tsering, who's the representative of His Holiness, the Dalai Lama to North America. Mr. Tsering assumed the post of representative of His Holiness on December 1st, 2017. He was born on July 1st, 1953 in Tibet. He's an alumnus of Punjab University. He was also a former member of the Tibetan Parliament in exile from 1979 to 1982, and he joined the Central Tibetan Administration in 1983 in the post of Deputy Secretary. In 2014, he was appointed as Kalon of Department of Education, reappointed at the same post in 2016. Mr. Tsering today will speak about the significance of March 10th in Tibetan history, and we'll also discuss the current state of affairs inside Tibet. Our second speaker will be Robert Destro, who served as Assistant Secretary for the Bureau of Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor at the U.S. State Department. He just left the State Department not too long ago, where he was also the Special Coordinator for Tibetan Issues and served in that position as the 6th Tibetan coordinator to work at the State Department. He was also the first ever U.S. official to welcome a senior representative of His Holiness inside the State Department for a face-to-face meeting. Our third speaker is, and Mr. Destro and former Assistant Secretary Destro will be speaking about the experiences of his position inside the State Department under the Trump administration and how it dealt with Tibet and how it brought this issue before the attention of global policymakers. Our next speaker will be Ellen Bork, who's a longtime Tibet observer and currently a contributing editor at The American Purpose, where she writes about American foreign policy with an emphasis on democracy and human rights. From 2018 to 2020, she was a visiting fellow at the Project 2049 Institute, where she focused on American policy toward the exiled Tibetan leadership and Mongolia. Her writings have appeared in numerous newspapers, including the Washington Post, Financial Times, and the Wall Street Journal. At The American Purpose, she's also a contributing editor, and her experience in foreign policy dates back to the days of the wonderful great senator from North Carolina, Jesse Helms. Our last, Ellen will be talking about what will be the new challenges for the Biden administration with Tibet, and also kind of share her geopolitical perspectives on Tibet and why it matters. Our last speaker will be Dr. Adrian Zenz, who's a senior fellow in China Studies at the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation in Washington, where he also supervises PhD students at the European School of Culture and Theology. His research is focused on China's ethnic policy, public recruitment in Tibet and Xinjiang. as well as Beijing's internment campaign in Xinjiang and China's domestic security budgets. He's also the author of Tibetanness Under Threat and co-editor of Mapping Amdo, Dynamics of Change. He will be speaking today about the use of forced labor as a launching pad for the fine-grained approach to poverty alleviation and Beijing's latest evolution of micromanaging minority lives, including the mandatory land herd transfer scheme to lastingly alter livelihood modes. Adrian has been a wide, outspoken expert on the developments in the forced sterilization program inside Xinjiang, and he's certainly done that, single-handedly brought this issue to the attention of U.S. policymakers at both the State Department and also the National Security Council. So on that note, I'll turn the floor over to our distinguished first speaker. Ngodup, please tell us, what does this date means in the history of Tibet, and what is happening now inside Tibet?
Thank you. Yeah, thank you, Glenn. And touch the leg. Good afternoon to everyone, and particularly to our special coordinator, former special coordinator, Assistant Secretary Robert Destro, and Ellen, and then Adrian, that I had the privilege of knowing all of them. So today, well, first of all, I really wanted to thank Glenn Howard, president of Jamestown Foundation, for organizing this virtual event on this momentous day. So it is extremely important day in the history of Tibet. The Tibetans and supporters all over the world commemorate the 10th March every year as a Tibetan National Uprising Day. So today is the 62nd anniversary of our Tibetan uprising, which means that we have been in exile for now last 62 years. It is also a solemn day to remember and pray for more than 1 million Tibetans who sacrificed, who lost their lives under the Chinese, communist Chinese regime. However, it is also a day of courage, bravery, and resilience of Tibetan people. So 6 million Tibetans resisted communist China's rule for more than 6 decades, and it's still going on. And we stand in solidarity, very much in solidarity with people, Tibetan people inside Tibet. So today, as of now, I came to New York this morning, actually to attend a Tibetan protest rally in front of the United Nations to draw the attention, for the plight of Tibetans inside Tibet. And the New York actually has the largest Tibetan population in North America. And then after that event, the Tibetan protesters, they marched to Chinese consulate in New York. So Tibetans everywhere in the world, they actually come out into the street and tell their story of, occupation and invasion by the communist China for 62 years ago, and then the repression and injustice and discriminations that are being met to the Tibetan people in Tibet under its brutal rule. So, we lost more than 1 million up to now under the Chinese rule through torture, execution, and even starvation. So on 10th March, if I take you a little bit on this day, on 10th March 1959, His Holiness the Dalai Lama was, invited by the Chinese general in Lhasa Station, in a military camp that time, for a theatrical performance in its headquarters. And day prior to that, the news, reached to the people that the military general, the Chinese military general, was asking His Holiness to come and attend the event without any personal bodyguards. So that was shocking for the Tibetan people. And excuse me, as soon as this news, reached the Tibetan people, and then the Tibetan people voluntarily, spontaneously came out of their homes and then started to guard, to form a human chain around the Nubulinga Palace where His Holiness was residing. Because, there was a clear reason for that. Early on in Eastern Tibet, in Kham and Amdo, when they started to invade those places before they coming into the Tibetan Autonomous Region, they invited many high lamas, important people, and then later on they were found disappeared. Nobody knew about that. So this has been a sort of a trick or the game that the Chinese leaders have been playing. And that is why people got very suspicious that His Holiness is, invited to come to the theatrical performance, but without any personal bodyguard. Can you imagine? So that actually prompted the Tibetans to get together and try to stop His Holiness from attending the event. And then it started to stay on for a few days. And after 6 days or 7 days, I think Chinese started to shell the palace and then the Lhasa town and then Potala Palace. All these things happened, and thousands of people were killed during that time. So that is why it becomes very important for us that this day has brought a historical change in the life of Tibetan people and the life of Tibet as a nation. So the Li Zhengli, she's a Chinese scholar, and she wrote a book called Tibet in Agony, and it was published by the Harvard publication. And she said that, quote, the Chinese Communist government has twice invoked large-scale military might to crush popular uprisings in capital cities. The second incident, the notorious massacre in Tiananmen Square in 1989, is well known. Now she says, the first 30 years earlier in Tibet remains little understood but today. Yet in wages of destruction, bloodshed, and trampling of human rights, the tragic toll of March 1959 massacre surpassed Tiananmen, unquote. So this is the extent of what happened to the Tibetans during that fateful month. And then, following that, so much destruction has been done to the Tibetan culture. The more than 6,000 monasteries were destroyed, monks were disrobed, nuns were raped, and then the important sacred item of faith, like statues and the scriptures were strewn on the pavement, and people are asked to walk over or piss on them or spit on them. So all these sort of sacrileges, they cause in order to insult the Tibetan Buddhist faith. So this has been going on even now, and then the Tibetan people resisted for so many years, and more than 156 Tibetans died due to self-immolation, because they wanted His Holiness to come back. They wanted freedom to be given to the Tibetan people. So these are the two important aspirations by the self-immolators since then. And then, however, in 1979, Chinese paramount leader Deng Xiaoping, he sent a message to His Holiness Dalai Lama's brother, saying that except for independence, anything can be discussed over the table. So that message was sent to His Holiness, and His Holiness reciprocated, in a positive way. His Holiness said, yes, we can discuss the future of Tibet. And that is why the idea of genuine autonomy was proposed. So genuine autonomy, what it means, we say the middle way approach. So what it means is we cannot accept the present state of affair in Tibet. That means ruthless, brutal Chinese regime and treatment. But at the same time, we will not claim for independence. So that was a sort of what the middle way approach means. But the Chinese later on said, okay, can you give that proposal in writing? So that His Holiness and the Tibetan administration gave that in writing too. But there was no political will from the China's side. And without describing or without giving any explanation, they said that, oh, this is simply independence in disguise, or it's a semi-independence proposal. Or sometimes they say, oh, you want 1/4 of China. So, and then at one time they even put conditions to His Holiness saying that you should accept that Tibet has been inalienable part of China. And then also said that, you have to accept that Taiwan has been inalienable part of China. So His Holiness replied, as far as Tibet is concerned, it is the historical fact that Tibet has been independent before 1951. And as far as, so he said, I cannot change history. History is for the historians. And as for Taiwan, I have nothing to do with it. That's a separate country. But it shows, this is a sort of pretext of just keeping it for a while, just lingering it. But then, the real truth is that they are not willing to talk about it. So there have been 9 rounds of talks between the representative of His Holiness and the Chinese government, but nothing substantive actually has happened. And lately, during Xi Jinping's time, it has started to deteriorate in Tibet. He introduced 4, major policies in Tibet, which I think is all very, detrimental and aimed at total elimination of Tibetan race, Tibetan language, and Tibetan heritage itself. So that is one is introduction of ethnic unity law, which means that they're encouraging and promoting the marriage of intermarriage between Tibetans and Chinese. And the second is the Sinicization of Tibetan Buddhism. They said that Tibetan Buddhism should be used to explain the need of the socialist China. And then thirdly, the bilingual policy, which Human Rights Watch has actually brought a whole proposal. So through the bilingual policy, they are actually trying to make the Tibetan younger children not learn about their mother tongue. And then fourth is the fourth level, as our research scholar Adrian will explain a little bit later. So these 4 issues, these 4 policies, 4 measures that I see that's being introduced even during the pandemic is all aimed to, increase, to accelerate the annihilation, the elimination of the Tibetan people. So the situation in Tibet is extremely grave. Freedom House has 2 days back brought a report about Tibet and the overall, freedom status all over the country. And then Tibet has been ranked as the least free country, along with the Syria. Last year, Syria was the last, and then Tibet was next to last. But this year, it is now both are the least free country. And the Reporters Without Border, they also mentioned that Tibet is most inaccessible country in the world, even more than the North Korea. So Human Rights Watch has written a lot of report on Tibet, and then CECC has written a report on that. Andren has made a report on that. So there are plenty of reports what tells about what is happening in Tibet. So it's in the dire need of help. It's a grave situation. And we are, however, very grateful to the successive US Congress, US administration for passing number of legislation, for giving all the necessary assistance to help promote and preserve our culture, language, and identity in exile. So we'd like to take this opportunity, I like to particularly take the opportunity to thank all the people who have been responsible in really helping, Tibet. And then our former special coordinator, Robert Destro, who is here with us. I really want to thank you also. During your short time, you've been so active, so supportive. And this morning, I heard that you were with the Tibetan people at the rally in front of Chinese embassy in DC. So those are actually, some very inspirational deeds, which back in Tibet, they get so much inspired. They get so much encouraged. It gives them a hope to continue the struggle. So we look forward to more such with the Biden administration as well. And also allow to thank the Secretary of State, Anthony Blinken, for giving a very strong statement last time, during the Tibetan New Year, which was organized virtually by the State Department. So we'd like to thank, and also like to thank Speaker Nancy Pelosi for giving a very strong press release today to mark the 10th March. So finally, I wanted to thank Glenn for your foundation, for organizing this, wonderful event. And it actually tells how, how important and how serious in a way the Tibet situation is becoming. So thank you very much for the time given to me to talk about Tibet.
Thank you very much. Very much appreciate your insights on the tragedies and suffering of the Tibetan people. I'm very appreciate your participation today as well. I'd now like to move to our next speaker, Bob Destro. And Bob, we're very anxious to hear about your experiences inside the Trump administration with this. And we already have one person who's emailed and asked, what suggestions do you have for the person who'll be taking your position in the Biden administration? So as you finish your talk, work that question, and we look forward to hearing what you have to say. Bob, the floor is yours.
Well, Glenn, thank you so much for having me today. Thank you, and to the staff at the foundation for putting on this this great little event. It's a real honor to be here today. It was a real honor to be with the intrepid band of demonstrators this morning outside the Chinese embassy. For a change, it was actually nice weather, but one of the comments that I made this morning is that the juxtaposition of the massive embassy and the intrepid little crowd of demonstrators, shows what the people of Tibet are up against. And as you go back into the history, and I think I'll address the question you just mentioned. What advice do I have for my successor? It's not a bad idea to think about what it is you can realistically accomplish with Tibet. I spent, if I had to pick an issue on which I spent most of my time during my tenure from roughly the middle of September of 2019 to January 20th, was China. And it was, it began, my service began with a UN panel on Xinjiang and the plight of the Uyghurs. And it ended actually literally walking out the door after midnight on the 19th, working on the genocide declaration that Secretary Pompeo made about what was going on in Xinjiang with the Uyghurs, which Adrian will talk about to some great extent in a little bit. Why Tibet then? Well, I guess the short answer is Tibet was the precursor to what we're seeing today. Everything that, as Mr. Tsering has just said, everything that has happened in Tibet is now happening in Xinjiang and elsewhere. And so let me just kind of run down some of the lines of effort that I worked on. And I think that this gives us a much more robust picture of what it's like to deal with China. That's the advice, is like immerse yourself in Tibet and Xinjiang to find out what you're dealing with as in the context of being an assistant secretary, or I think my successor is likely to be the undersecretary. I think they'll get that through the Senate a little faster than they did with us. But let me just tick off a list very quickly about some of the lines of effort that I worked on that were primarily Xinjiang, but certainly also Tibet. We were the first. We have identified. we think, the first actual survivor of an organ harvesting case. We haven't made it public yet, but we certainly got him out of Southeast Asia and here into the United States. And I think that we will show you an aspect of human trafficking that has long been rumored, but not confirmed. I think we're about to confirm that. Forced labor in Xinjiang, and also forced labor being exported to other countries, not just other parts of China, but into other parts of the world. I spent a considerable amount of time talking about the supply chains, forced labor in supply chains that then makes its way into to the stores and supermarkets here in the United States, which undercuts organized labor, in this country, depresses the job market, and forces people to buy things that were made with slave labor. And the growth of the surveillance state in China and elsewhere, including here in the United States, as Ellen Bork pointed out just before the meeting started. Other people have had some trouble with Zoom, and we know that early on that there was. We just, as my wife had said many years ago, she says, "Do you think our phones are tapped?" I just say, I assume our phones are tapped, and I assume that people are listening in on this call as well. We spent a lot of time mapping Chinese malign influence around the world, and what we mean by that is the degree to which Chinese malign influence penetrates and basically takes over the space of democratic places. I mean, I spoke to several neighboring countries where they really are despairing about the ability to preserve their own democracies in the face of the Chinese onslaught. And so we see that, by force in places like Xinjiang and Tibet, in subversion in other countries around the region, constant threat in Taiwan. So, I mean, what are we looking at as a good outcome? Really being free of that kind of subversion. We looked at the COVID-19 authoritarianism. That, I'm not sure why the West ever decided that it should try the Chinese lockdown method, but this is exactly what has been done. And we've seen the impact here in the United States on human rights, and a good deal of time as well on trying to figure out how to get information in and out of China, including Tibet, meaning our bureau at the Human Rights, Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor is the point of the federal government's spear on internet freedom. And so we spent a good deal of time on that. So Tibet really is the object lesson about where things are going. Tibet was the first step in China's subversion of its neighbors and its domination of its neighbors. There are some very interesting and contemporary issues that I'll mention briefly before I turn it back over to you, Glenn. But what we see in great relief in China today and in Tibet today is the destruction of the language, the destruction of the culture, the domination of the religion, the attempt to sinicize Tibetan Buddhism, which we are now seeing with all the Christians as well, with the Muslims in Xinjiang. But also the destruction and the use of families as weapons, the destruction of the family, the destructions of other key intermediate institutions like the monasteries, and education. And so basically what we saw is Tibet was the proving ground for where we are today in Xinjiang. I think that if I were going to give my successor some advice, it would be first, take some time and learn how to play the ancient game of Go. That's a much better way to understand how the Chinese operate, to surround, dominate, surround and dominate without firing a shot, and to make it impossible for there to be a middle way. I mean, that's basically what we've got going around the world. To look at the connections between business human rights, technology and human rights, education and human rights, religion and human rights, and the environment and human rights. I mean, Tibet is the roof of the world. It's also the source of 5 great rivers that it is busily polluting and will be using to put pressure on its downstream neighbors. So I think that's more than enough to get the conversation started from my side. So Glenn, I'm going to turn it back over to you, and I'll look forward to any questions that people might have toward the end.
Thank you very much, Bob. That's certainly going to be some very big shoes to fill a State Department to replace you. And but I think you've given a kind of good roadmap for what to look for. Our next speaker is Ellen Bork, and Ellen is going to talk about the challenges for the Biden administration coming in. Ellen, you're a very long time observer of Tibet. You did a very interesting kind of scenario exercise at Project 2049 Institute a while ago that looked at some of the options for Tibet in terms of the succession issue for His Holiness. So please take the floor and tell us what's important. What do you see going on?
Thanks so much, Glenn. I really appreciate the invitation, and I'm delighted to be here with all of you. You asked me to talk about the outlook for the Biden administration, and I'll be happy to do that. On Tibet, even before the administration began, the Biden administration made a very good start in the sense that during the campaign, President Biden issued a statement on Tibet, and that's not something you would necessarily expect. So it raised people's hopes and expectations. And then Secretary Blinken followed up during the Tibetan New Year with a message to the annual party that normally takes place inside the State Department building, but this year was held online. And that was lovely. It was very much about preserving Tibet's culture, language, and religion, which is a very sort of a core element of American policy on Tibet. It was extremely appropriate to the occasion and very welcome. Going forward, I would say it's not nearly enough to continue to focus on those elements of America's Tibet policy, because America's had a fairly admirable but narrow focus on human rights and religious freedom, while the Chinese Communist Party is approaching Tibet from a strategic vantage point, using Tibet literally to project power across borders, but also using the issue of Tibet and Tibetan Buddhism to advance alternative norms in its relations with other countries and in international organizations. In order for, I think, the Biden administration has signaled that it likes very much a number of the revisions to America's approach to China that were made under the Trump administration, and suggested that it'll be a little bit, the changes will be as a matter of tone and style rather than substance. But if that's really going to be the case, I think that on Tibet, they will very much need to make a shift and to respond to the China's approach to Tibet in a somewhat different way. Chiefly, the Chinese Communist Party has made a huge priority out of Tibet, and the United States hasn't. Again, because of we take a sort of approach on human rights and religion, they take a strategic approach. The Chinese Communist Party has a domestic agenda for Tibet, and we've actually heard quite a bit about that, and Adrian's going to talk about that, so I won't really go into a lot of that. But even from the very outset, even with comments by Mao Zedong, the party recognized Tibet as a strategic issue, and it has become a major international issue. They have a major Tibet agenda internationally, in which they demand deference to its position on Tibet. They have imposed litmus tests on Tibet at the UN agencies and in their relationships. Tibet is certainly, to the extent anybody objects to it, any country who wants to participate in the Belt and Road or have other kinds of relationships with Beijing knows that they can't meet the Dalai Lama, can't express support for Tibet in any way. And I think actually we've all become somewhat inured to this over time. It's something that's become reflexive to know. And I don't want to blame any particular administration for that. I think it was very hard when trying to conduct business with China on other matters, not to fall prey to their intense pressure over Tibet. And so it really is up to the Biden administration to work with its allies, as it has said it wants to on so many other issues related to China, to bring Tibet into that discussion and into any coalition, any cooperative aspects. Where are we at? So I think you know that the two big issues that are coming up, or one big issue, is the reincarnation. His Holiness is 85 years old. He's spoken about what will happen with regard to his reincarnation. He issued a statement in 2011. I hope maybe Ngodup will, and discuss this in ways that he can, that I can't, except that every American should know that His Holiness rejects any Chinese role in the determination of his successor. The Chinese Communist Party will appoint some kind of an imposter and then demand deference to that figure. So we really need to approach this now. His Holiness has laid out a couple of scenarios that might happen, but the key is that it's his prerogative. The procedures, the integrity of the process is up to him and those he designates. As Glenn mentioned, at Project 2049 Institute, we convened a tabletop exercise trying to imagine what will happen when His Holiness passes away, not in a religious sense, not what he's going to do, but how will countries react? What will China demand of them? And so forth. And we divided into country teams. And I recommend other people do that, because we need to be prepared to think about it. It's not so obvious for countries that are used to deferring to China on so many issues. And we need to frankly claw back the support for Tibet that has been lost, especially in Europe, but around the world, in response to Chinese pressure. And on that point, I would also say there's another issue that gets even less attention, which is the democratic exile government as a legacy of His Holiness, but also as a supreme achievement of Tibetans in exile. It's and Ngodup was served in that government. It is something that I've argued should be a part of the United States' Indo-Pacific approach to the Indo-Pacific and emphasis on democracy. We're trying to raise or qualitatively change our relationship with Taiwan. There's no reason that we shouldn't do the same with the exile government. There are differences, of course, and we have a defense commitment to Taiwan that we certainly couldn't with regard to Tibet. But outside Tibet, there are these important institutions that deserve our support. And as China tries to exert more and more control over not only Tibet, the Tibetans under their control, they are also trying to erode the procedures for Tibetans' exile democracy in other countries, in Nepal, and we need to stand up to that. I think that's really all I have to say right now. I guess there's one other point I'd like to make. I think it's often overlooked. The party portrays itself as China. They've made Tibet a taboo issue inside China. It's dangerous, to say the least, for any brave Chinese person to talk about the freedom of Tibet. Nevertheless, some have and suffered for it. The Charter 08, the democracy manifesto that was issued in 2008, did not use the word Tibet, but clearly referred to minority areas and federations, and a way to try to respect and solve the Tibetan issue and other minority issues. And I think it's really important for people to realize there are plenty of Chinese people who are willing to work on that basis, and we shouldn't be afraid of talking about it at the state level and in our all of our civic organizations. So thank you, and I appreciate it.
Thank you very much, Ellen, for that broad overview of what you think the challenges will be for the Biden administration, and also the nuts and bolts of the U.S. Tibet policy. I will now turn the floor over to our last speaker, who is Adrian Zenz. Adrian, it's a light that you're able to join us today. I know you were busy testifying this morning to Congress, along with 5 other persons about U.S. relations and with Tibet and the state of Tibet. So please give us some information about what you see is happening now inside Tibet among the issues that you cover.
Yes, well, thank you indeed, Glenn, for having me part of this very interesting panel and on a very important topic of Tibet, which I think is very important not to neglect what is going on in Tibet, in spite of some of the other sort of maybe more high-profile events that are taking place either in the South Chinese Sea or border clashes with India, which are linked to Tibet, of course, but or Xinjiang with the Uyghurs. So in Tibet, of course, we have, as the previous speakers have very well explained, Tibet has long been representative of some of the core strategy of Chinese ethnic policy, because Tibetans have long posed a particular problem. This particular problem, of course, has come through the fact that the Tibetans have a high-profile political and spiritual representation outside of China that has largely not been under Beijing's control. In particular, challenges come with that and sensitivities. And at the end of my talk, I want to touch on how the most recent developments in Tibet are actually reflective of a significant change under Xi Jinping of China's ethnic policy in general. So in Tibet, we of course have seen all kinds of developments. We saw religious assimilation, linguistic assimilation, greater freedoms under Deng Xiaoping. After the Cultural Revolution, then a gradual tightening on neo-integrationism, as some have called it, already with Hu Jintao. And then, of course, from 2011 and 2016, Tibet was governed by Chen Xuanguo, who now is party secretary of Xinjiang. And Chen Xuanguo pioneered a whole lot of policing and other surveillance techniques and strategies, which he then later on applied in Xinjiang. It was very likely that he was brought into Xinjiang for that very reason. So the link of Chen Xuanguo and what he represents is very important in understanding what is going on and how China is approaching this. Similar methods, of course, are being applied to other minorities too, and the Han Chinese themselves. Poverty alleviation has become a signature initiative of Xi Jinping's. However, poverty alleviation has also become a very coercive tool of fine-grained control and assimilation. And what we are now seeing in Tibet is sort of a cross-fertilization between Tibet and Xinjiang, whereas initially in 2016 and 17 especially, a whole number of policing techniques and social control mechanisms were exported from Tibet to Xinjiang, applied in Xinjiang at drastic speed. We are now for the first time seeing something, a coercive labor transfer, vocational training and labor transfer that is not unique to Western China, labor transfer, of course, but a particularly forced labor transfer system that was developed and is unique to Xinjiang, now being exported and applied to Tibet. So let me briefly look at this and then draw conclusions. So the Tibet Autonomous Region has had rural surplus training, the training of so-called rural surplus labor, meaning people who are employed in agriculture, but who, because of the ratio of land to people or the limited availability of land, who can be considered underemployed. Any developing country has a surplus labor problem. And the strategy is typically to then get lesser productive agricultural workers to move on to other sectors, the service sector or the secondary, the industrial sector. They go work in factories. And the Tibet Autonomous Region has had a related small-scale rural surplus labor training and employment initiative targeting Tibetan pastoralists and farmers for certainly since the early 2000s, as much of other parts of China. From 2012, however, we already saw an interesting pioneering initiative in the Chamdo region of Tibet, to quote, military-style training for surplus labor force transfer for pastoral and agricultural regions, end of quote. The scheme was formally established in the 13th five-year plan from 2016 to 20, the goal of training 65,000 laborers under a military-style training now. In March 2019 came the key policy, and this, of course, after everything had already happened in Xinjiang. In March 2019, the Tibet Autonomous Region issued a key new policy called the Farmer and Pastoralist Training and Labor Transfer Action Plan, mandating military drill, training with work discipline, Chinese language, lectures on Chinese law and work ethics, aiming at enhancing laborers' sense of discipline to comply with national laws and regulations. And in this document, and then later on, you have quotas for transfer, you have very high pressure language for goal achievement, for poverty alleviation, which was the end of 2020. Labor transfers are supposed to follow a order-oriented method where the job is arranged on company needs, so companies can order workers, the government takes them, trains them, and delivers them to the company, which is how it works in Xinjiang as well. In 2020, the TAR then introduced a region-wide labor transfer policy that established quotas for each region, how many thousand to train under this policy and to transfer. And the transfer of trained rural surplus laborers, the total training and transfer of 600,000 rural surplus laborers for 2020, of them 55,000 to be transferred to other parts of Tibet. So to a different prefecture than their home prefecture in the TAR, and 5,000 exported to other parts of China, imitating like the Uyghur surplus transfer from Xinjiang to other parts of China. Each prefecture and county assigned a specific quota. By the end of 2020, the transfer scheme to cover the entire TAR, job placements in road construction, etc., skip some of the details. Workers transferred to their destinations in a centralized group-style point-to-point fashion. Highly supervised, highly regulated, very similar to Xinjiang. Now, we need to understand Xinjiang has two different systems of forced labor. The more better known system of forced labor comes out of the internment camps, directly out of the internment camps. The lesser known system, which is responsible for labor transfers to other parts of China, is the labor transfer system of rural surplus laborers, which is also coercive. Those people have never been in a camp, but they're of course liable to be sent to a camp if they don't comply. They're recruited coercively. Everything is coercive about it. There's even accompanying cadres, government officials, and even police security guards involved. Training is military drill style. And this is what we're talking about here in Tibet. So in Tibet, I'm not talking about a huge system of internment camps that lead into forced labor factories that are like on the grounds of internment camps or next to them. I'm talking about the coercive labor transfer system. And this labor transfer you find in many parts of China, but it's not everywhere coercive. So the schemes employ military drill, closed military-style training management to produce disciplined obedience, to transform laborers' thinking and identity. So part of the coercion is about transforming and changing the thinking, the backwardness, quote unquote, and to mitigate the negative impact of religion. There's a constant battle against religion, against traditional culture, closed, quote unquote, mindsets, etc., etc. And there's a lot of pressure on government officials to achieve this. There's a whole system of rewards and punishments for officials who fail to meet their labor transfer quotas for each county. As with the Uyghurs in Xinjiang, overcoming Tibetan resistance to labor transfer is an integral part of the mechanism. Rural laborers are to be transformed from being, quote, unwilling to move to becoming willing to participate. Coercive elements play a very important role here, starting from the recruitment through village-based work teams. And here, the Tibet Autonomous Region, of course, has many of the same social control mechanisms as in Xinjiang. Village-based work teams go from house to house, and they talk to people, they recruit people, they coerce people into participation. Another very disturbing aspect that's found in both Xinjiang and Tibet, and I've not seen it for other places, is well, at least not in the same way, is a trusteeship scheme or transfer scheme of transferring herds and land into state-run cooperatives or large private cooperatives running under government support, whereby the usage right or even the right to use a land or animals, these are now being surrendered and given into these collectives And in exchange, in Tibet, they get shares. They become shareholders. So you have, like, say you have 100 yak, but now the government wants you to become a factory worker. So your 100 yak are being given to the local state-run collective, and they're no longer yours to use, but you get shares and you get like a profit share because the collective who is herding the herd is making a profit, hopefully, supposedly, well, reportedly. And then you get paid out, the Tibetans get paid out a profit, and they are liberated to participate in labor transfer. So they have no more excuse to not become factory workers. And you can, of course, you can imagine. So the changes in livelihood that come along with this, you can only imagine what that means. But perhaps the most concerning is to see that Xi Jinping's ethnic minority policy approach is increasingly characterized by a logic of securitization, militarization, focus on transforming minority minds, behaviors, and livelihoods, all of that powered and driven by detailed digital databases. Where everybody's, I have some of the spreadsheets, you know, everybody's name, ID number, what they're doing, what they're working, how long they've been working, what their income is. They must be liberated from poverty. It's a very detailed system. Nobody can escape it. These mechanisms are highly intrusive. Nobody is left out. Nobody can hide or run from these government schemes. So the long-term implication is a change in ethnic minority approach from a gradual willingness to do like a trickle down or gradual assimilation, where, for example, President Jiang Zemin in 2000 launched the Great Western Development Initiative with infrastructure, with jobs, etc., trickling down. Long term, you could choose to participate, you could benefit, you could get a job, but you didn't have to. But now, Beijing no longer relies on a voluntary or gradual long-term assimilation facilitated by such economic incentives. Now, minorities are being forced to comply by way of intrusive micromanagement from the state, a state armed with sophisticated surveillance systems, databases, and intensive forms of social control. An additional point I would like to raise, and this is my final point, points to the non-economic function of labor transfer. So my most recent report, which was published on Xinjiang labor transfer, published last week with the Jamestown Foundation, discussed a non-public research paper compiled by Chinese academics that argue that labor transfers in Xinjiang represent a long-term measure to promote the assimilation of Uyghurs and to reduce the population density. According to a legal analysis compiled based on the findings of that research report, several legal experts noted that Xinjiang's labor transfer program meets the criteria of the crime against humanity of forcible transfer and the crime against humanity of persecution. The report, the legal evaluation, states that the evidence from the study violates, quote, the prohibition against forcible displacements aimed at safeguarding the right and aspiration of individuals to live in their communities and homes without outside interference. We know that in Tibet, there's been significant transfers of Tibetans. This whole relocation scheme, physical relocation, building these sort of high-rise apartment complexes to resettle Tibetans from high altitude to low altitude and to concentrate them, which is of course part of the government control strategy, also brings them closer to jobs and factory parks. There have been large shifts of populations in both Xinjiang and Tibet. Labor transfers are part of that, also promote shifts of population transfers. So Beijing's concern in Tibet here is not likely to be about population density because it's quite low. It's about centralizing populations under closer government control, uprooting and tearing apart traditional communities potentially. Of course, entire villages might be together relocated into a high-rise space. What does that mean? Is there a Buddhist temple there or not? What is the traditional setting? And what are the long-term effects of all this? Anyways, thank you.
Thank you very much. And Adrian, you're always very comprehensive, and we appreciate that so much. Your voice is so desperately needed to talk about these horrible situation with the forced migration, sterilization. I'd like to remind everyone watching today that if you want to ask a question, in the Q&A, question and answer section of the chat room, you can ask a question. We'll try to address it. I myself have a number of questions I'd like to ask people, but until we get a few questions, I do want to ask Bob and Ellen to address the issue of how U.S. allies in Europe are dealing with the succession issue and about Chinese influence on our allies in terms of how they address Tibet. And Ngodup, while we're getting an answer for them, I want to ask you a question about the monasteries and how China is Sinoizing the monasteries by advocating their pretender. That's something I'm very interested in. Adrian, if you want to voice I'm curious about what is Germany's approach to Tibet in your native Germany, and how are they responding? What is your perception too of how you see Europeans going? So I'll start off with Bob. Do you want to answer the question about our allies in Europe, and then go to Ellen, and then we can go follow in order.
Well, I think that everybody's pretty much in the same boat. Whether they're allies in Europe are a little bit more distant, but they see the threat. Allies in South Asia and the Pacific, particularly the Australians and the New Zealanders, have felt the sting, felt the Chinese lash actually very personally, and the subversion. And so the question is, what do you do? And there are huge pressures on these countries and on their economies. One of my colleagues, former Undersecretary Keith Kroc, spent much of his time dealing with the Chinese threat brought about by technology and 5G, integrating Chinese technology into your infrastructure. We've had that debate here over integrating the TikTok app, and so the allies are somewhat, everybody's more or less in the same boat. We're somewhat flummoxed on how do you actually deal with the Chinese without basically having them begin the process of pretty much subverting your independence and your ability to maneuver freely.
On the Tibet question, I think the Europeans the Chinese were very effective at dividing Europeans over Tibet, breaking down the more stalwart countries in various ways. Some, I think I'd say, I think several kept meeting with His Holiness, but you'll see that, that diminished quite a bit. Tibet figured in the pressure that was imposed on Norway over the Nobel Peace Prize being awarded to Liu Xiaobo, so that when Norway came under intense pressure for that, the solution for them to get back in the Chinese good graces involved a concession on Tibet. So what really needs to happen is for there to be a unified effort to raise support for Tibet and prepare for the reincarnation issue, and develop a stronger position on Tibetan exile democracy with a view towards a democratic China and Tibet under whatever form that might take. There's a fellow, I think I'm going to get his name a little bit wrong, Jonas Perlo-Plessner, who wrote a piece recently about an economic Article 5 that would modeled on the NATO Article 5, which would help prevent China from imposing economic costs on anybody who had the temerity to speak up on human rights or Tibet or anything else. And it was in the Wall Street Journal. Everyone should Google it and find it. It was a great idea. And it in part because it brought this issue out into the open about how difficult it is. And, many countries have politicians or other, business figures who are very focused on the economic relationship with China. And they need to have this balanced by an appreciation among their populations of what the costs can be in that dependence, or that, pursuing that interest to the exclusion of others.
Uh, yes, and regarding Sinicization of Tibetan Buddhism, and particularly with the monasteries, Gillen, actually, what Assistant Secretary Destro said right from the beginning, that Tibet has been the first stop or the precursor for a lot of things that are happening right now. So we always used to say that if you don't transform China, China will transform you. And ironically or incidentally, the previous Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo, actually used in a different word, but the same meaning. In Los Angeles, when he gave, in 2020, in August, he gave a address there. And he said that if we bend to the CCP right now, our children's children will be at the mercy of CCP, So that's what he said. And this, I take it very seriously. And we've been always saying this. Now, before it was just Tibetans, and then now we have Uyghur, brothers and sisters. Now there are Hong Kong, there's the Southern Mongolians. There are now, threatening Taiwan and India and many countries in the Southeast Asia, small countries. It will be just a matter of a few years that they will also come in the pack of victims like us, So that is why it's actually very important. Now, coming to your question about the monasteries and Sinicization of Tibetan Buddhism, and as Ellen mentioned about reincarnation, Buddhism, the Tibetan Buddhism was the first war on faith by the communist China, and that's very interesting. They are atheists, but now they start to, first of all, they destroyed monasteries. They, did all this sort of sacrilegious to the object of worship and the faith. Now they are saying, okay, they would like to take care of the next Dalai Lama, which is a reincarnation. So this is strange. It actually in 2007, they promoted, they introduced order number 5, and that said that all the reincarnate Lama should be approved by the CCP, which is like getting a license for the business, So if you don't have that license, you will not be called as a reincarnate Lama. And they know the reincarnate Lamas really wield a good influence over the people. And that's the only thing that they wanted to control. And through that, they actually wanted to control His Holiness Dalai Lama's next reincarnation. And on the other hand, they don't understand that the reincarnation is a deep Buddhist philosophy. You're believing in a life after death. So the atheists don't talk about believing in life after death. It's kind of a joke. They even don't believe in any faith. Now, all the faiths like Christian, like Muslims, all are now coming under attack by them. But at the same time, they're saying they wanted to take care of the next Dalai Lama. So that's their main motivation is only capturing and controlling the Buddhist world. And through that, because Dalai Lama has so much influence over all. And then in the monasteries, now what they're doing is in the monasteries, there is a monastic management committees. And all these monastic management committees are chaired by the party officials. So they are intruding into the daily activities of the monastic life, and they do not know anything. And then at the same time, in the Tibetan Buddhist monasteries, if children and the parents want, they can be admitted into the monasteries even when you're young as age 5 or 6. Now they stopped it. They said you can be admitted only after 18. So this is just like stopping the flow of a stream from the main source. So in a way, they are actually trying to destroy the Tibetan Buddhism as such. And then 2 big monasteries. Well, what happened in the 60s and 70s, that they destroyed 6,000 monasteries. And then the Tibetans, His Holiness Dalai Lama with the Tibetan administration in exile, they got it all trained. Lamas and monks and scholars, they are trained and they sent back to Tibet. And as a result, now there was a renewal of all these monasteries in Tibet. But then, the biggest monastery, which is Larunga and Yachinga, Laurunga has 10,000 monks, and the Yachinga is a nunnery for 5,000. All those have been downsized to half. The abode of the monks and nuns were destroyed, and then they were sent back to their respective places. They were ordered not to come back. So that's what it happened. And then even the nuns were asked to dance in front of the military people, so just to insult them. And some of the nuns were even stripped naked. And so quite a few actually committed suicide out of embarrassment and shame. And then take the case of Panchen Lama. He was kidnapped when he was 6 years old, only a child. And even now we do not know if he's alive. Now it has been 26 years that he was in captivity of Chinese regime. We only hope that he's alive, but we do not know. They say that he is alive, but we really do not know. Instead, they put one, their own creation of Panchen Lama in his place. So people don't trust and have faith in the candidate that was put by the Chinese Communist Party. So that is why, he has no influence. So these are the sort of things, they are trying to slowly control Tibet, control the Buddhist world, and at the same time destroy it from the root.
Thank you. Adrian, do you want to answer the question, weigh in?
Yeah, I am not much of an expert on government policy on Tibet, including that of my native country of Germany. I do know that Germany and Germans tend to care quite a bit about Tibetans, particularly. At the same time, I think some of that is maybe a fascination with the culture, but when it comes to the hard rubber hits the road commitment on human rights, or especially human rights versus economic gain, Germany continues to be very reliant on exports, has been very reliant on China, and is not acting with a lot of geopolitical strategy in that respect. And I think we're all quite shocked when the heavily German-led and dominated European Commission, and Germany at the time directed by Angela Merkel, Germany was head of the EU at the time, in the 6-month rotation, signing the investment agreement with China, despite mounting allegations of forced labor, both in Tibet and Xinjiang, and then being content to just let China, say we will make some effort towards some unspecified effort towards ratifying ILO agreement. And then later on, there was interviews with Chinese academics who basically said, well, look, this is not going to happen. That's a problem. That's the discrepancy between maybe some of the sentiment, maybe some of the idealism, but then the reality, I think, there's not the action that would actually make any kind of difference. Quite to the contrary, it's playing into the oppression. I mean, it's almost rewarding Xi Jinping for everything he's done by saying, oh yeah, end of 2020, a good time to finally get this deal signed. So I think that's all really bad news when it comes to actual European or German policy on ethnic minority rights in China. And I'm not sure what is going to change about that.
Thank you, Adrian. We have a question from the audience from Jamestown non-resident senior fellow Matt Brazil, who's asking a question about in the rest of China, the CCCP generally allows religious worship as long as it's a congregation approved and supervised by the Provincial Religious Affairs Bureau. Why did the CCP not pursue such a policy in Tibet and Xinjiang? Why are they determined to wipe out religion in these two autonomous regions rather than co-opt it? I'll let you guys decide who wants to address that question. Maybe Ngodup, you want to address it? I don't know, but please feel free to weigh in.
Well, I'd like to make a couple of comments. First of all, I think that that they're allowing it. They're allowing religion in other parts of China. You know, I think that in particular they see the Muslim community in Xinjiang as being a terrorist threat, and they talk about that all the time. I think that the subversion of the monasteries has been ongoing for quite some time, and the Vatican is finding out the hard way that going along and allowing the Chinese communists to appoint your bishops is going to be the short road to the oblivion of the Catholic Church in China as well. So basically, again, it's you can be a religion as long as you worship the Communist Party and toe the party line.
Well, yeah, I would like to make a comment too, and I agree with Bob very much. As because for them, party is the most important thing, and party is there. You are there for the party, not the party for you. That's how they take it. And in terms of Tibet, the Tibetan Buddhism, for instance, Tibet is a core issue for them, for the Chinese, because it has been a case of occupation. So, right from the beginning, they were saying that there are the three T's: Tibet, Tiananmen Square, and Taiwan. That time, the Xinjiang issue hasn't blown out as yet, and Southern Mongolian too, not that extent. So these three T's, they never, there's a critical and core issue for them where they cannot compromise. So with regard to the Buddhism as such, it's not only praying, in Buddhist philosophies, people study. It's a lifelong study, meditation, practice. So it's all together. And then, it's not just going to the monastery for a prayer, one session or two sessions in a week, not that. So that is why, they wanted to stop it. And other thing is, because they think that Buddhism, Tibetan Buddhism is, an identity issue for them. It's that, it makes Tibetans separate from the CCP. So that is why they wanted to cut everything that is separate to their beings. And number two, then they do not trust His Holiness Dalai Lama. In the Tibetan Buddhism, because the Dalai Lama is an emanation of God of compassion. That's how we believe. So people, even right now, whatever the level of persecution they do, people still believe in Dalai Lama. So they wanted to cut this relationship, and because they do not trust His Holiness, and then notice why they are not trusting His Holiness. His Holiness has always been for a genuine middle way approach, genuine for a win-win situation for both Tibet and Chinese. But there is no political will with China to see this is resolved. So all these are kind of intricate. And then when Tibetan Buddhism is allowed to practice and study, then the Tibetan language comes in. Tibetan language is a must to study, that ism, that the faith. So now they're even cutting at the root of the Tibetan language itself. So whole idea is, to me, looks like they really want to totally eliminate Tibetan as such.
Thank you. Ellen, I wanted to ask you, when you did your exercise on the succession to the Dalai Lama, how did you see the Paching Lama and what China was going to do with the succession? How did you kind of, in your report that you did and discussions, how did you kind of configure that into the kind of the evolution of the succession?
But what we did was we just took as a premise that there would be, His Holiness would pass away, and how would India, the United States, China, and the Tibetan exile leadership respond? And it just made for interesting discussions. Sometimes until you are forced to articulate something, you don't think it through. And it's clearly an issue that's been on the horizon for a long time, but it was just an effort to prod people to begin to think about this. And sort of, I would say, predictable results in a certain way, but I think it was a bit of a jolt to the people who wish to be prepared and for this in the United States to begin to talk about it and float ideas for preparing in advance. And I think for a long time, I know from personal experience that it's a difficult subject, especially for Tibetans that I have worked with on these issues. But His Holiness himself has devoted a lot of thought to it and continues to talk about it. It behooves all of us to think about it and to anticipate the kinds of pressures and also the kind of, I think, educational or informational efforts we can make to, in a democratic society. Typically, I think people want to, respect for religious freedom often means deference and not getting involved in other people's affairs. And I'm not suggesting we get involved, but we have to be aware that China is so determined to subvert this process and become acknowledged as an authority on Tibetan Buddhism for this and other purposes, that we have to see how our tradition and respect for religious freedom should enable us to be a little more active and informed, and urge our leaders to do the same.
Thank you. We have a question from Tenzin, who's asking a question about the new management committees will run the monasteries and will have authority over the previous democratic management committees, which will now be responsible for rituals and other matters. Can you, Mr. Tsering, Ngodup, can you discuss that a little bit? Do you have any insight on what these new management committees will be doing and running the monasteries?
Yes, in the olden days, in a traditional way, the monastic proceedings, monastic, duties or schedules or whatever, including teachings, they are all managed by the monastic people themselves, including the abbot, and then some, people who would be asked to perform those responsibilities. So they are there, they know, what is important for a monastic life to be observed. And now it has been actually a little while, now maybe a few years, this monastic, management committees have been set up in all the monasteries. And the top person in that monastery is a Chinese Communist party man. So he would like to see that monastery is controlled according to the whims and wishes of the Chinese party. So therefore, all these things, whatever is happening under that, situation, well, you can really understand. So it's kind of really suffocating for the people, who are there, because they are being asked to do something by people who do not know anything about that, And then the party, now this is maybe in a way sanitization also. The party person in the committee would like to see that the monks, maybe for some security reasons, they do not, do something anti-national or whatever. But then at the same time, they actually wanted to control the monastic life. So that's the main difference. In the traditional way, its main responsibility is to, facilitate the scholars, the monks, the nuns who are in the monasteries to perform their spiritual practices, spiritual responsibilities better. But now that's not the case.
We have a question from Henry, who's asking, the next Dalai Lama is likely to be a very young child. How do you maintain the influence of the Dalai Lama while he or she is a child?
Ngodup?
Yeah, well, His Holiness, the 14th Dalai Lama, up to now has been both temporal and political leader or temporal and spiritual leader of Tibet. Now, 14th Dalai Lama saw to it that it should not be a theocratic institution. So he started democratizing the Central Tibetan administration, the Tibetan government in exile. So now we have a political leader separate from his religious or spiritual world. So His Holiness Dalai Lama is the spiritual leader, whereas we have a political leadership elected democratically by the people for a period of 5 years. Therefore, now politically, what His Holiness will, the influence of His Holiness will play out is something to be known later on, although because he doesn't have that political responsibility. But then because the 14th Dalai Lama has so much influence all over, not only Tibetan people here, but Tibetan inside so much, and then the other countries as well. So that influence is still there. So it's up to the people, how would they respect the young Dalai Lama. And then I would definitely say this, the whole world, except China or the CCP, they will respect the 14th Dalai Lama that has been recognized by, as per the tradition of the reincarnation, reincarnation system.
Thank you. We are now kind of approaching the end of the program, and I would like to do a lightning round of going around asking everyone, what do you think the United States should do? What would be your policy recommendations if Anthony Blinken was tuning in today and listening to our broadcast? What would you advise him? What would be on your high on your list of asks and things for the United States to do to help Tibet? Bob, I'll start off with you.
I would suggest that the first thing he needs to do is call his own political appointees together and get them on the same page and get them to pay attention to what's going on in Tibet. He's not going to be able to do this by himself. Even if he gets the vice president or the president on the phone with other leaders, they're going to divide Tibet from the other issues. They said, well, Tibet and Xinjiang and human rights, those are all separate issues, and I think that there's going to have to be a consistency of message from the secretary that human rights are at the center, that you cannot, these are the people that we're going to have to be dealing with in economic affairs. And if they will sell your kidney, they'll also subvert you as well.
Thank you. Ellen?
I would hope that Secretary Blinken would, as Bob says, make Tibet related to all of China's, all China policy, to, frankly, I think, step back, make it a strategic policy, not one confined to ameliorating suffering inside Tibet. And I had one other point, which is now escaping me. So I'll think of it later. Sorry.
Okay. Feel free to do a 2-finger interjection. So
Right.
Adrian.
You'll find that I'm not often that strong when it comes to policy recommendations for governments. Maybe that's because that's not my passion. I'm a researcher and academic. But what I have noticed, and it fits, I've noticed that a lot of governments, including the US government, have not understood well some of the changes that happened, especially as they've happened quite fast. Changes in ethnic policy, changes on the ground, effects of recent policies. I think there's been too limited understanding of what has been happening, and too much of a reliance also on people coming in and out, but that freedom is largely gone. A lot of people cannot go in and out anymore out of either Tibet or Xinjiang. And so I think governments like the United States need to increase their capacity to proactively research and understand the situation on the ground. The second point I'd like to make is I think it's increasingly clear, and I think Robert has made this point very well, that human rights is not a niche. Human rights actually have a lot of connections to national security. The link between human rights and national security, I think, really needs to be foregrounded now. I think it's, of course, most evident perhaps in Xinjiang with what's been happening, but now the development and the exporting of sophisticated surveillance and control to other authoritarian nations, or the exporting of certain brands of authoritarianism and how to enforce them. And I think this connection, we need to find ways to really write about this connection, make a point, make an argument, and foreground it.
Thank you. Those are good for someone who doesn't give policy recommendations. I think you're spot on. And Ngodup, do you have a parting comment?
Yes, I just, first of all, wanted to say thank you to Secretary Blinken for the very strong video message that he has issued during our Tibetan New Year, and which was received by Tibetans all over the world, especially people in Tibet. They were very much inspired. Thank you for that. And my only request right now is to please implement the Tibet Support and Policy Act 2020 that was passed. And out of that, the most important thing, urgent thing on the basis of urgency is the appointment of special coordinator. So there are so many on the list, but I think this I would like to confide here. Thank you.
Thank you, and I think that's a very important point on implementing the Tibet Support Act, and I know that Bob played a role in that, and maybe we can convince them to do a clone of Bob and have his replacement be his mini-me. So,
yes, if I remember one thing, just if you don't mind, as you mentioned Bob. So Bob's, one of the biggest contribution was to invite our president, Central Tibetan Administration, Dr. Sangye, into the State Department. And this is a historic and has a lot of huge political ramification for Tibetans. So I would, urge that the present administration, Secretary Blinken, would follow suit.
Thank you. It's a great recommendation. We do hope the Biden administration will follow that path. We have a last thought by Ellen. Ellen, you wanted to say something?
What I would suggest is that the Biden administration invite the next Sikyong, the next head of the elected exile government, to the Summit for Democracy. I would make sure that the Dalai Lama is received or is visited at a very high level, and suggest possibly Vice President Harris could call on him in India. And also that they undertake a historic review of why Tibet policy evolved so differently from the way we approached the Baltics.
That's a very good suggestion, in the true spirit of Jesse Helm. So thank you. Appreciate it. Everyone, we very much thank you for participating today. And on those watching, we will be posting this video webinar online, and you'll be able to look at the Jamestown YouTube channel. So thank you, everyone. I wish everyone a safe day, and we hope to see you again.
Thank you so much.
Thanks again.